nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Natha Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsad Valajano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Murakedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdnani Patyakshito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kado Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madanamohano Adadanastrinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhuli Syam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputrakanta Dasya Vilashati Balashpavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdhanta Haitrurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajandhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Chetasame Chittam Satam Marukari Yatu Pada Padme Ya Bhakti Nikhilartha Varga Janani Ya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sokyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Param Bhuja Yugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Yaram Ya Nikhilaghabar Yaram Ya Nikhilaga Shanga Shamani Srotratritim Sangata Ya Swadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mahita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the Kris Jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we'll continue our discussion of Padyavali. And today we'll enter into discussion of the 6th verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam. We're here in the section on Sotsukya Prarthana, or prayers full of eagerness, and Sri Rupa Pad concludes this section with the 6th and then the 4th verses of the Shikshastakam. So how these verses are also instances of prayers full of eagerness, we'll see in the course of discussion of them, and we'll look at how they've been discussed by Kaviraj Goswami Pad in the Charitamrita, as well as relevant statements from elsewhere in the works of Sri Rupa Sanatana and others that illuminate their import. So I'm picking up top of a new file. Next, the compiler cites two prayers filled with eagerness, composed by Sriman Mahaprabhu for the purpose of teaching Bhaktas. So simply put, the Shikshashtakam, or the Ashtakam, which is for the purpose of teaching, the commentator interprets it as teaching for Bhaktas. Sri Kaviraj Goswami Pad introduces the first of these, the 6th verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshashtakam, as follows. Again, intense longing and humility arose, and he prayed to Krishna. And he prayed to Krishna to chant his name with prema. In the 5th verse of the Shikshashtakam, which was cited earlier here in Padyavali 71, Sriman Mahaprabhu humbly prayed to Krishna for bhakti, specifically bhakti in the spirit of servitude, and did so with the attitude of considering himself a jiva in samsara. In other words, he spoke from that perspective. In this ensuing verse of his Shikshashtakam, as a result of humility and longing arising even more intensely, Sriman Mahaprabhu prays to Sri Krishna to chant his name with prema. So then the question can come, what's the line of thought between the previous verse and this verse? Why does this prayer follow the previous one? The increase in humility and longing that inspires the 6th verse can be understood to be caused by an inner reflection after expressing the 5th verse. That one cannot personally render service to Sri Krishna, as was prayed for in the 5th verse, in a manner that is genuinely satisfying to Sri Krishna, without prema for him. And feeling an absence of prema within himself as a result of prema's nature of producing insatiable desire for more and more of itself in those who have it, such that they always feel themselves to be devoid of it, Sriman Mahaprabhu then feels it would be more befitting to pray to be able to chant Sri Krishna's name with prema. That is, to make a most simple and appreciable gesture of adoration for Sri Krishna by means of chanting his name, with what is most essential to satisfying him, prema for him. So in the 5th verse, right, Ainanda tanuja kinkaram patitam vishame bhavam buddha kripaya tava padapankaja stita dhuli sadrisham vichintaya. Please consider me like a particle of dust fixed at your feet, as this prayer is considered to be a prayer for rendering constant personal service to Bhagavan in his personal company. Then if someone prays for this, or as Mahaprabhu prays for this, then the way the line of thought is interpreted here is that then the inner reflection comes, but who am I to do that? Who am I to serve Krishna so fixedly in that personal way directly to his feet? If I could just even here within my position in samsara, just once even sing his name, just once even say his name with love, that would be a step up from where I'm at now. So why don't I just pray for that? When will I really just chant the name of Krishna with love? In other words, if serving his person is conceived as ultimate, then this non-different, yet in some sense, I dare say, in a limited sense, a lesser sense of him as his name. In other words, it's one thing to adore his name, and it's another thing to adore him personally manifest with his rupa and expressing his gunas in the midst of his lila. So as though there's a subtle simultaneous distinction in the midst of the non-distinction between the two. in the spirit of humility, he's saying, let me just truly chant Krishna's name. Let me just chant his name with prema. That would be the fulfillment of my aspiration, or that would be itself a perfection in my life. So thus, Sriman Mahaprabhu, still speaking from the perspective of a jiva in samsara, as he did in the previous verse, expresses this sixth verse out of a feeling of the absence of prema within himself, a consequent feeling of humility, and a further consequent feeling of intense longing for prema, and the blessed privilege of chanting Sri Krishna's name with prema. So people may chant whatever number of rounds every day of the Maha Mantra or the Krishna Mantra or various other mantras that contain however many names of Krishna, 3 or 16 or what have you. So how many thousands and thousands or lakhs and lakhs of names of Krishna is someone chanting? But if someone could chant one name of Krishna with pure prema, what would make Krishna more satisfied? So in all the midst of all this chanting, let me once truly chant. Let me once really sing his name, express his name. Let me once chant with prema. This is the way that the spirit of the verse can be encapsulated. This can be affirmed by reference to Sri Jivapad's commentary on a prayer of equivalent import cited by the compiler in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu as an illustration of the limb of bhakti known as entreaty. So in the Sindhu we find this verse, Karaham yamuna tire nāma tava kirtayan udbhashpa pundarikaksha rachayishyami tandavam. O lotus-eyed one, when will I dance on the bank of the Yamuna, chanting your names and streaming tears? So, in terms of categorization and understanding the spirit of these prayers, then Jiva Goswami's comment in the Durgama Sangamani on this statement is significant. So, just as Mahaprabhu here in the 6th verse says, when will I chant your name with tears streaming from my eyes and my voice faltering, then this verse cited here by Rupa Goswami says, when will I dance and sing your names as tears stream from my eyes? So the two prayers are extremely similar in their expression. So therefore, the way that Jiva Goswami and Rupa Goswami categorize this verse in the Sindhu can also be understood to apply to the content of the verse here of Mahaprabhu. So Jiva Goswami gives the following analysis, and just one point of reference beforehand, the category of bhakti among the 64 limbs of bhakti, known as entreaty or vigyapti, is of 3 types. One type is called samprarthana, which means an earnest request or prayer. Then there is dainya bodhika, and so that which is expressive of humility. And then there is lalasamai or lalasamai, a prayer full of longing. So to say, some prarthana and lalasamai, that there's an earnest prayer or an earnest request, and then there's longing. What exactly is the difference between these two? They're almost could be thought of as synonymous. So that's the topic that Jiva Goswami takes up here. And he says, Karaham yamuna tire, in the aforecited verse, is a prayer from afar from someone in whom bhava, that is bhava bhakti or rati, has not manifested. Since an earnest prayer, or samprarthana, that is the category of prayer to which this verse principally belongs, is of someone in whom bhava has not appeared. Whereas longing, or lalasa, is of someone in whom bhava has manifested. So this is the distinction that's being shown. That a quote, some prarthana or request for something is made by someone who doesn't have that thing. Whereas this quality of longing is conceived here as referring to a state of wishing for something out of an intensity of bhava for that thing. So lalasa refers to those in whom there is bhava, and some prarthana is expressed by those in whom there is not bhava. Since one in whom there is not bhava is a sadhaka, and the aim of sadhana is the attainment of bhav, so the earnest prayer, the object being requested is bhav. So you don't request that thing that you don't have unless you don't have it. So if you are requesting it, it implies you don't have it, since no one asks for that which they already have. So this is the logic into the categorization. So quote, this is the distinction. Even an earnest prayer in this case, that is, in the case of the verse under discussion, because of its also being constituted of longing, is spoken of as longing specifically here in this classification of types of entreaty. Thus, this is classified as an example of entreaty constituted of longing, even though it is principally to be understood as an instance of the category of entreaty known as earnest prayer. So, in other words, he's saying there's undoubtedly overlap, and he's saying, although Rupa Gosvami has categorized it as an instance of lalasa, for Jiva Gosvami, perhaps being a little more exacting in terms of categorization in this case, is saying really it fits the other category, but because it also contains some element of this, it's been shown in the second category. So, in gist, since the 6th verse of Srimad Mahaprabhu Shikshastakam and the prayers cited above in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu are of equivalent import, the main point to be gleaned from Sri Jivapad's analysis here is that these two prayers are to be recognized as entreaties that are one, fundamentally constituted of an earnest prayer, or some prarthana, on the part of one in whom bhava has not manifested, and are two, also filled with a high degree of longing, or lalasa, for bhava, that is, prema. So, someone might pray for bhava, but they might not really pray that hard, or they might not really deeply pray. It might be lip deep, or it might just be a mere, recitation of theory. But to both pray in the state of want, meaning absence, and to do so with a longing or a strong hankering for that thing, then that would be an instance of something that is categorically, fundamentally some prarthana, but practically speaking also described as lalasa, or longing, because it's a form of some prarthana that's largely colored by an expression of lalasa. But because in this other earlier discussion in the Sindhu, the idea of lalasa was described as a sanchari bhava of the experience of rasa, then that's considered only an expression of those in whom there is bhava present. So for the sake of keeping these categories set apart, this analysis is given. So Sriman Mahaprabhu thus expresses his prayer in the 6th verse of the Shikshastakam, both for the purpose of further absorbing himself and relishing the bhava of a bhakta, aspiring for bhava, and for the purpose of instructing jivas in samsara, aspiring to follow the path to the attainment of bhava. So in other words, it's a request by someone who doesn't have it for the attainment that's colored by a high degree of longing for the attainment, for bhava. So, what a useful prayer. Or, if also the intensity of the lalasa, or the intensity of the longing, is highly influential in the efficiency or the the swiftness with which one will actually achieve it, then prayers which are expressive of that and therefore, by being cultured, are also engendering of such intensity of desire in the hearts of others, are highly apt for sadhakas in their aspiration. So, in this way, we can see the categorical position, so to speak, of this 6th verse in the Shikshastakam. Pardon me. Nayanaṁ galad ambu dhārayā, vadanaṁ gadgada ruddhayā girā, pulakair nicitaṁ vapuḥ kadā, tava nāma grahaṇe bhaviṣyati. When will my eyes become filled with, when will my eyes become filled with streams of flowing tears, my mouth become filled with words stifled by stuttering, and my body become fulfilled with horripilation as I call your name. Oh, there's a small typo. So the Charitamrita has this verse slightly differently. If anyone's concerned about these technicalities, the word ashru is used instead of ambu in the first line. So that's not a mistake. Rather, all editions of Padyavali have it with ambu, whereas all editions of Charitamrita that you find have it with ashru. And ashru is probably the more accurate or the more likely spelling, but ambu works nonetheless. So I just let it be according to the sources of Padyavali. So now we'll look at some extended discussion of this prayer. The compiler explains how the sattvika bhavas prayed for in this verse, namely shedding tears, stuttering speech, and horripilation, become manifest in a bhakta, in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So first we're going to look at some technical analysis of sattvika bhavas from the Sindhu. Since this verse is essentially saying, when as I call your name will I experience sattvika bhavas? When will these 3 sattvika bhavas come to me as I call your name? So if we're praying to experience these sattvika bhavas, then what are these sattvika bhavas that we're praying for? And what are the characteristics by which they are identified? And as we'll get to, what are instances in which one can appear to have them but actually doesn't, and so forth. So all of these details are analyzed in the Sindhu as follows. The psyche, imbued either directly or somewhat indirectly with bhavas related to Krishna, that is, one or more of the 5 primary ratis, or any of the secondary ratis, is called sattva by the wise. So we think, when we hear the word sattva, we often think of sattva gun, or we think of the mind, or we think of existence in general, or we think of the state of being a sadhu or sat, or virtuousness. The word sattva has so many meanings. So here's another one, or here's yet another technical sense that the word sattva can convey, which is interesting. So the psyche, when imbued with bhav, is called sattva. So this is perhaps in one sense a strong way of putting stress on the importance of bhava, or the importance of the bhava that's a manifestation of Bhagavan's Swarup Shakti, the essence of the samvit and ladini functions of the Swarup Shakti. That when the mind is imbued with that, then it has existence, or it has goodness or rightness or substance to it. The implied meaning being the one in whom bhava has not manifest is not considered sattva in this case. And of course, in this usage, sattva doesn't refer to the sattva gun of prakriti and all of that. So, when the psyche imbued with bhava is called sattva, those bhavas which manifest from this sattva are called sattvikas. So what are sattvika bhavas? They're bhavas that emerge from sattva. They're bhavas that emerge when the psyche, when the citta is imbued with bhava. So therefore, they are outcomes or expressions of bhava. And it's not in this context, but, in other words, it's not in this set of quotes, but in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the subject is also brought up. Well, if sattvika bhavas are just outcomes of sattva, and sattva is just the outcome of bhava, or the presence of bhava, then sattvika bhavas are just anubhavas, because, the ingredients of rasa are vibhavas, anubhavas, sattvika bhavas, and sanchari bhavas, but there's no real difference between sattvika bhavas and anubhavas if you actually break down how they're defined. So Rupa Goswami himself says, yeah, that's true. But nevertheless, I have still categorized them differently. And the essential difference between them is that, or is hinted at in the word in this translation, involuntarily. So it's not in the translation, but it's in the bracket explanation that I've added, which is based on statements that come later, the statements that I'm paraphrasing now, which are that although they're both broadly speaking anubhavas are anubhavas, or outcomes of bhava, that come about or are also mediated by or expressed with the utility of the intellect in guiding their expression. So to smile, to laugh, to sing, to dance, to clap, all of these type of anubhavas, they also are felt and experienced by the bhakta to be voluntary actions that one electively performs, and that one can also, to a certain extent, control how they're expressed. Whereas in the case of sattvika bhavas, they're conceived to be non-voluntary, or they're not conceived to be a volitional action, so to speak, but more a reaction or an outcome of bhava that is forcing itself out, so to speak. The way if someone starts to weep or to tremble or horripilate, this isn't something that they decided to do at this moment. It's not just an act among those who have the skill to do those actions by wish through a performative approach, but rather these are outcomes, these are effects that just involuntarily come out. So how is it that they're involuntary? The implication of, quote, the psyche becoming imbued with bhava implies that it's not the psyche functioning conventionally according to the buddhi that's bringing out this outcome, but it's the psyche imbued with bhava, and then the bhava itself, having this influence that is bringing these things out. So anyway, for anyone who's fond of all these, contours of categorization, these are the points that are made elsewhere. But not to belabor so many technicalities, let me move on. So some further categorization of sattvika bhavas and how and why they're expressed from a functional perspective is as follows. The psyche, in the aforementioned state of sattva, forcibly casts itself into the prana. So the bhav has possessed the psyche. Now the psyche casts itself into the prana, or the psyche starts exerting an effect over the prana. And the prana then undergoes transformation and intensely agitates the body. So then the prana produces further effects, and these sattvika bhavas are the outcomes thereof. Then these bhavas of stupor and so forth occur in the body of a bhakta. These 8 sattvikas are known as stupor, perspiration, horripilation, distortion of the voice, trembling, discoloration, weeping, and swooning. The prana sometimes takes shelter in one of the four elements of earth and so forth, and sometimes becomes independent, that is, becomes solely situated in itself, and moves all throughout the body. So now he does an analysis. When the prana combines with which element does which sattvika bhava come out? So he says, the prana situated in earth produces stupor, the prana sheltered in water produces weeping, the prana situated in fire produces perspiration and discoloration, and the prana sheltered in space produces swooning. This, situated in itself, and having assumed a state of being light, moderate, or intense, in that order produces in the body the three sattvikas known as horripilation, trembling, and distortion of the voice. So, categorization like this, I'm not going to further elaborate. The state of sattva defined in these verses arises only in the case of someone having attained a sthayi bhava. That is, having received a self-manifestation into the psyche of prema bhakti, or at least bhava bhakti, which is also known as rati, the sprig form of sthayi bhava. The compiler defines these forms of sadhya bhakti as follows, so just for reference, although we've discussed them repeatedly already, bhava bhakti is defined as follows: that which is constituted of a special aspect of pure existence, or shuddha sattva, is a bearer of resemblance to a ray of the sun of prema, and is a melter of the heart with hankerings. Hankerings for what? Desire for attainment of Krishna, desire for self-performed favorability, that is, for personally rendering service pleasing to Krishna, and desire for affection, that is, for exchanges of affection with Krishna, is called bhava bhakti. That very bhava, meaning bhava bhakti as afore defined, upon becoming intense in nature, marked with extreme mamata, and that because of which the heart becomes completely melted, is called prema bhakti by the wise. Although states that can appear like the 8 sattvika bhavas are at times observable in those in whom bhava and prema bhakti have not manifested, one should not infer that such states are indeed genuine sattvika bhavas, or that such persons are thus possessed of bhava or prema bhakti. So you might say, oh, shedding tears. I've seen people shedding tears. I've also shed tears. Therefore, I'm a prema bhakta. He's a bhava bhakta. So, although shedding tears is a characteristic or a symptom of having prema bhakti, it's not that therefore anyone who has the symptom necessarily has that cause, because tears can also be created by other causes. There are tears. They have many causes. One is prema bhakti. So just because the effect is there doesn't mean that this is the cause of it, because it has other causes. So what are those other causes? That is discussed also by Rupa Gosvami. So he says, those sattvika bhavas that sometimes become manifest because of delight, amazement, and so on, produced by hearing sweet and astonishing narrations of Bhagavan, in a person devoid of rati, who resembles a bhakta, are called rukshas, or dry sattvika bhavas. So ruksha means dry. The implication being that real sattvika bhavas are not dry, they're rich. they're saturated with bhav. They're full of rasa, so to speak. But when someone doesn't have any bhav, doesn't have any rati, then someone who might nevertheless be engaged in some activity of bhakti, they might be hearing about Bhagavan and shedding tears as they hear this narration. If that's not really an outcome of bhava itself, then those are quote-unquote dry tears. Although the tears are of course wet, the spiritual substance of them is dry. Or in other words, it's absent. as in the case of the person described in the following verse. Quote, although disclosing his own heart to be devoid of even a trace of rati, by his actions dedicated solely to the attainment of enjoyment, the body of he here who was nonetheless delighted for the moment by sweet songs of the play of Madhava, then horripilated. So this is quite a nice depiction. So in other words, nowadays kirtan has become used, especially in the West, and now from the West back into India, as a medium of popular, quote-unquote, spiritual entertainment, where, people who are skilled musicians who can sing nicely, put together musical arrangements and entertain people with kirtan music. So people in the midst of experiencing such entertainment can also be moved to dance, to sing. Maybe they horripilate, maybe they shed tears, maybe they jump up and down excitedly, carried away by the waves of the music and the excitement of the kirtan. And they may, as far as they're concerned, be thinking, oh, this is some type of spiritually blissful celebration or festival or, chant or what have you. So, peace be upon them all. I'm not here to detract from that, no harm, so to speak. Let the people chant, let them be happy. But, the only but in this regard is that in the case of persons, experiencing horripilation or tears and so forth in those cases, why is that not an instance of bhava bhakti? Then here this comment of Rupa Goswami in this verse is very significant by saying, disclosing his heart to be devoid of even a trace of rati, by his actions dedicated solely to the attainment of enjoyment. So this is to say that if really a person's heart is saturated with bhav, then all their actions are going to be related to Bhagavan, all their actions are going to be related to pleasing Bhagavan. And if someone doesn't have bhav, and therefore is not experiencing the bliss of experiencing Bhagavan and the bliss of bhakti to Bhagavan, then they're going to feel devoid of bliss, and the mind can't tolerate that. The mind is, so to speak, always in gear to pursue that. If there's, some older manual transmission cars, and I've driven some tractors on some occasions where certain, vehicles, when you take them out of park, without even putting them into gear, they go forward, so to speak. And you can't actually not go forward or be at a stillness when the engine is running. It's only if you actually put a brake on it that it'll stay still while it's running. So for me, sometimes I think of the mind like that. The mind is like an engine that's just churning and running after sukh. That's just how it's built. And you can either go into gear, you can either, make a concerted effort or a strong effort at pursuing it in one way or the other, but the mind actually can't not do that. So if someone is not, so to speak, in gear or in the bhakti gear for the psyche to be attuned to or aligned in its drive towards sukh with bhakti, with Bhagavan, with the pleasure of Bhagavan, with the sukh of Bhagavan, then the mind is going to run towards sukh in some other gear. It's going to run towards it in some other layer, and that's going to be apart from bhakti, apart from Bhagavan. So that would be what's referred to here as actions dedicated solely to the attainment of enjoyment. The implication here would be enjoyment means an experience of sukh apart from bhakti, apart from Bhagavan. So when someone seeks any type of pleasure independent of Bhagavan, independent of the Ishtadevata, independent of bhakti, then that is itself a symptom of lacking bhava, of lacking rati. This is what Rupa Goswami is saying. Disclosing one's heart to be devoid of even a trace of rati by his actions dedicated to the attainment of enjoyment. So this is a strong point, that if someone who really has bhava, the idea of feeling sukh or feeling satisfaction or pleasure, or whatever you want to call it, independent of Bhagavan, is like, what? Like, there's no such thing. How would that happen? And it actually wouldn't happen when bhaktas are, their awareness is trained on an object that is perceived to be independent in some way. It's not a cause of satisfaction or pleasure, even though it might be for those who are evaluating it solely in a sensuous manner, just as someone might, be presented with some excellent plate of cooking and be, oh, look, this food is all very tasteful. And then the bhakta is thinking, this is not prasad. This has not been offered to my Thakur. Why would I take it? So the very same object is, at some, let's say, fine restaurant somewhere, for the bhakta, it's like, no. And for the, non-bhakta, it's like, oh, great, I'll pay $100 for that, or whatever. So to pursue enjoyment independent of Bhagavan, independent of bhakti, this shows the heart to be devoid of bhav, devoid of rati for Bhagavan. This is how Rupa Goswami is saying it. So if someone is living their life like that, if they're, once a month on the weekends going out to hear music, they hear some rock and roll, they have a great time. This week they go to kirtan, this week they dance to the kirtan, next week they go to the rave, they're dancing, singing, shouting with joy at all three, then this would be the instance of rukshka, or something entirely dry. In other words, the person is devoid of any rati whatsoever, they're just pursuing enjoyment, but nevertheless, in that course of their pursuit of enjoyment, they happen to hear some sweet songs of the play of Madhava. They happen to hear some kirtan about Krishna, and they are delighted by that. So, in the one hand, from a broad perspective, that's blessedness, that's good fortune on that person, that's a good thing. We're not saying that there's anything, so to speak, bad about that. That's fine. But from a categorical perspective, when you're trying to define sattvika bhavas, then you're negating this as off or out of what qualifies as actual sattvika bhavas, even though the cause, so to speak, you might say the material cause of the symptom is also, in one sense, an act of bhakti, because it's not an act of bhakti that's imbued with bhava. There's no sattva, and when there's no sattva, it doesn't meet the definition of Rupa Goswami's, quote, sattvika bhava. So, in one sense, it's not even fit to be called a sattvika bhava, but nevertheless, it's still labeled here as a, quote, ruksha, or dry sattvika bhava. So, without further elaboration, this horripilation that described in the aforesaid verse, which was previously called a semblance of rati, in seekers of mukti and others, is referred to here as dry by the wise because of its being devoid of rati. So this is what I was referring to by saying, in a sense, technically it's not even a sattvika bhava at all, and that point is also made by Rupa Goswami early, because this whole discussion of sattvika bhavas comes in the 3rd chapter of the 2nd division about these ingredients of rasa, and this mention of rati abhas comes in the chapter early in the 1st division about bhava bhakti, by saying this is bhava bhakti and this is the semblance or the abhas of bhava bhakti. So this same thing, according to this network of categorization that Rupa Goswami develops, it's actually categorized as an abhas. It's not actually that thing, but still he's allowing it to come under the category of a sattvika bhava that's dry, even though technically it doesn't fit the definition of even being a sattvika bhava at all. This is how he's, sort of touching the same point from two different directions. And then the point about rati abhas or bhava abhas, which is described earlier, is as follows. If inner meltedness, meaning inner meltedness of the heart, similar in appearance to an evident characteristic of rati, is observed in seekers of moksha or others, that is, persons whose ultimate object is not actually bhakti in Bhagavan, this shall certainly not be real rati. That which is sought even by the liberated, who are completely free from all extraneous desires, which is highly confidential, and which is not given by Krishna quickly even to worshippers of himself, how can that, rati for Bhagavan, appear in the heart of those who do not perform pure bhakti on account of being possessed of desire for enjoyment or liberation? So it's a rhetorical question, means no way. Even bhaktas who are one-pointedly doing bhakti may not have rati, may not express sattvika bhavas. So someone whose goal is not even bhakti at all, that they're going to express this actual, sattvika bhavas or actual symptoms of rati? Impossible. The cause of wonder for the naive. This is some nice sort of pundit speech for, blind following or, uncritical analysis and so on. This cause of wonder for the naive, in other words, that which impresses the ignorant, that is the aforementioned inner meltedness that resembles the characteristic of real rati, but is actually not that, however, is easily understood by the wise through observation of its signs and declared to be a semblance of rati. In other words, when you know this broader, network of categorization, when you understand the characteristics of bhav and the characteristics of the absence of bhav, even if someone is showing this, quote, inner meltedness, meaning showing that their heart is melted such that the, tears or trembling or whatever is being shown externally, nevertheless, someone who understands the broader overall power of bhava bhakti is not going to be confused into thinking that this is an actual expression of bhava. So Jiva Gosvami makes this even more clear in his commentary. It is stated that specifically desirousness solely of him, namely Sri Bhagavan, is the primary characteristic of rati. So this is the point that we hear so many times again and again. Tadeka sprihatva, desirousness solely of him. This is the primary characteristic of rati. If, however, desire for something else shall arise in someone, then even in the presence of sattvikas, meaning apparent sattvikas, and so forth, similar to the characteristics of that, meaning of real rati is not to be considered. That is, one should not think that real rati is present. It is not that desire elsewhere and rati elsewhere is befitting, meaning it is not possible to simultaneously have rati for Bhagavan, the primary characteristic of which is desirousness solely of him, and desire for another object, such as moksha or worldly enjoyment. This is the purport. On account of someone's being possessed of desire for enjoyment or liberation, how can that rati appear in their psyche? It cannot. Therefore, for that reason specifically, he describes a fault also present in the sadhana of such a person, quote, of those who do not engage in pure bhakti. That is, he explains that rati does not manifest when someone improperly performs sadhana by continuing to foster desire for objects other than bhakti. For example, worldly enjoyment and liberation. The mention pure here in the verse means not mixed with jnana, karma, and so forth. So I think that makes it very clear. The only desirelessness only of Bhagavan, this is the symptom of rati. If someone is actively fostering other desires, then they evidently aren't someone whose only desire is Bhagavan. So if someone with all these other desires at times exhibits these external characteristics, then you know that these characteristics are not caused by rati, because it's not that rati is the only thing that can make people cry. Vishoy rati can definitely make people cry. Go watch whatever film you prefer from whatever popular studio you like. People can experience all kinds of emotions, all kinds of, transformations in the body, etc., as a result of entirely mundane forms of attachment. And then that mundane desirousness and attachments can also then blend with instances where objects related to Bhagavan and Bhakti become the stimuli involved. So the person's actually interested in moksha, or the person's actually interested in romance. He hears some narrative about Krishna, and for the mumukshu, it evokes a sense of longing to become completely free from all worldly attachments, and a sense of humility and the difficulty of that, and then they weep. So, okay, fine. But that this is an expression of bhava bhakti, impossible, because the person's not even trying to achieve bhava bhakti. Or someone's interested in worldly romance, they hear stories of Krishna's so-called romance, and this excites remembrance of romantic experiences or pursuits of their own in the past, present, or future, and then they're experiencing emotion A, emotion B, symptom A, symptom B. Although it seems to be related to Krishna, although they might sing out the name of Krishna as they're doing it, what's really going on in their psyche is all related to their material desires. So, although it's certainly in a broad sense beneficial for people to anyway cognize and be reminded of Krishna in any manner, and we're not here to deprecate that. Nevertheless, it should not be prematurely assumed that when this, cross-juxtaposition of object and intent is happening, that we shouldn't then assume that because the object is related to Krishna, that the intent and the inner cause of the reaction in the person is also bhakti, or is also related to Bhagavan. It in reality can be something completely otherwise. So these are the subtleties that Rupa Goswami and Jiva Goswami are trying to lay out in all of this. And the broader purpose being that when one understands this, one understands that bhakti is not a matter of showmanship, it's not a matter of, ritualized celebration and the excitement of group gatherings and all of this. It's something that has to do deeply with day in and day out, moment by moment, what kind of desires, what kind of thoughts, what kind of inner culture one is cultivating in the course of their life, and how pure, or in other words, how one-pointed their psyche becomes upon bhakti, upon Bhagavan, upon satisfying Krishna, upon all that is dear to Krishna. This ongoing, gradual, difficult, not group facilitated and marketable to the internet, but the actual inner culture that one does. This is actually everything. This is actually what it's all about, and all of those external social functions are at best able to partially support that. Then one can get grounded in what this path of bhakti is that the Goswamis taught and how hardcore it actually is. And to think that it can be, so to speak, mass marketed within, a pyramid hierarchical institution to every, modern, family life, not exactly. In other words, there's some way to bring something there, but to really cultivate this as it's meant to be cultivated, it requires, dedicated, first of all, study to understand these subtleties such that one can even have the chance of meaningfully doing this type of inner cultivation, and not just think that, joining the group and participating in group celebration is the whole thing in itself. and then not mistaking the people who get really swept up and excited about the externalized social events as being great because they do that. This is all this siddhānta can, so to speak, inoculate or at least cure someone from such thinking. So what it really boils down to is sadhana is the aim of which is bhav, the intensity to which one sincerely and one pointedly desires bhava and purifies the mind of desires and attachments to other things. This is really what the whole process of citta shuddhi, the process of sadhana bhakti, is all about, and why all these teachings are given, such that one can both deeply respect and cherish those great bhaktas who've reached that most blessed state of bhava bhakti and who express it in a most wonderful way, and also to not prematurely think that something that's not that, most great divine wonder of wonders is something else. So let's see, I'm almost out of time here. I don't think we're going to get quite through all this technical analysis today. I was hoping, let me see. Maybe I'll just go a few minutes over and we can just finish this whole talk of all these technicalities from the Sindhu in one shot, if I may. If it's too much in one go for anybody, feel free to sign off. But the rest of the commentary deals all specifically with the verse itself and the broader significance and the spirit of it. But I felt like it was worth going into all these technicalities to really have a crisp concept of what these Sattvika bhavas are, when we then look at why Mahaprabhu is praying to experience them and the broader significance of what he's saying. So, let me just finish this discussion. Sri Rupa Pad further delineates 4 subcategories of dry Sattvika bhavas. That is, states that appear to be Sattvika bhavas, but in reality are only semblances thereof. So, in this regard, Sattvika bhasas. I just mispronounced that a minute ago. So he's saying, Rushka Sattvika bhavas are also called Sattvika bhasas. So it's either a Sattvika bhava that's dry, or it's just a semblance of a Sattvika bhava. So these Sattvika bhasas are of 4 types. Quote, Ratyabhas bhava, Sattvabhas bhava, Nisattva, and Pratipa. So this is those arising from a semblance of Rati, those arising from a semblance of Sattva, those devoid of Sattva, and, quote, adversarials, or those that arise from anger, fear, and other adversarial states of mind in relation to Krishna. These are antecedently superior. That is, they are listed in order of superiority from first to last. So in other words, to be an abhas of rati is better than to be an abhas of sattva. To be an abhas of sattva is better than to have no sattva at all, or nothing like sattva, and at least have nothing like sattva is at least better than being adversarial to Krishna. In this regard, the first occurs in seekers of mukti and others as a result of an aforementioned semblance of rati, meaning in that passage that I read earlier from the 3rd chapter of the 1st division, as is described in the following verse. Quote, some resident of Varanasi, narrating the deeds of Hari in an assembly of ascetics, horripilated and wet his cheeks with his tears. So I didn't want to go into too much detail, so I just threw some commentary into the bracket. So Chakravarti Pad explains that Rupa Goswami just refers to the person here as a resident of Varanasi. So what does that mean? It means that the person's desire is actually moksha. So although a bhakta might reside in Varanasi, Chandrasekhar, Tapan Mishra, they resided in Varanasi, the idea here is that just by saying he's a resident of Varanasi, he's implying he's a mumukshu. So if a mumukshu is narrating the deeds of Hari, because mumukshus also do bhakti. Shankaracharya was also a great bhakta, so to speak, in the sense that he did actually promote the practice of bhakti, but did so as a means to the propagation of his Keval Advaitavad and the attainment of Sayuja Mukti. So, if persons following the Jnanamarg, persons seeking moksha, nevertheless engage in some harikatha and horripilate or cry in the process, then this is a semblance of rati. Or this is not actual rati because they're not actually desirous only of Krishna or desirous only of bhav, but they're desirous of moksha. So they don't actually have rati, but therefore they have a semblance thereof. Then sattva bhavas are described as follows: a semblance of delight, amazement, or otherwise, appearing in a heart that is soft by nature, is called a sattva bhava. No, that should be sattva bhasa, sorry. Sattva bhasa bhavas occur because of that, as is described in the following verse. The body of even an old mimamsaka, so again here the word mimamsaka is synonymous with someone who doesn't have bhakti. Rupa Goswami multiple times in the Sindhu, speaks of mimamsakas of having flaming tongues of, argumentative remarks, contrary to bhakti. So if an old mimamsaka, whose mind was delighted by hearing of Krishna's meanderings, horripilated, and alternately, as described in the following verse, how can the immense sweetness of the expertise and narration of you who shower forth profusions of the nectar of Mukunda's deeds be described by me? You, upon hearing of Prabhu's triumphs, from whose mouth even these materialists who are not even interested in him momentarily bear streams of tears in their eyes. So what he's alluding to here is that great storytellers can evoke emotions in people. If people experience all kinds of emotions, that's not that implying that they have bhava bhakti. Rather, that's a semblance of their mind becoming imbued with bhava. It's not actually happening. So in today's Vrindavan, there are so many popular lecturers and kirtaniyas who can, with their artistry and sophistication and the presentation of these things, move people to tears with their narrations. Okay, but this is, here he's categorizing it, this isn't really the person experiencing sattva and then an expression of sattva. It's a semblance of that. It's not actually that. Because those people might drive down from Delhi or fly in from Mumbai and hear the Katha Vachaka and shed their tears and then, go back to their tech job and, run after, enough money to tour the West or whatever, worldly pursuit they may have. And as they enjoyed Vrindavan and lost their heart, then also they loved their trip to Australia the next year or whatever, in this sense. Then nisattvas are described. Tears, horripilation, and so on can in some cases arise even without an occurrence of a sattva bhas, in one whose heart is slippery by nature. So this is an interesting choice of words, pichal. So then Jiva Gosvami comes along and says, what does slippery mean? So slippery means soft on top, but hard on the bottom. So, Rupa Goswami is in other words looking at the heart and saying, the whole heart can be melted, or there can be external meltedness, external softness, but the core is still hard. So that is what he's calling here nisattva. Or in one engaged merely in enactment thereof, or otherwise in the case of actors, one whose heart is hard inside and out, yet sheds tears, horripilates, etc., merely as a practiced act. So, various actors might play the roles of Radha and Krishna or Brajabasis or something like that, and serials or, Bollywood films or things like this. And then, after they, did that for a while, then they get a job doing, romance, or they get a job doing action movies, or, they're just off to act out whatever roles they can get. It doesn't have anything to do really with the content of the role or the quality of the script or the education that anyone might get from the film. They're just seeking their own fame and fortune and what have you. So in that case, they have a hard heart. Their heart is both internally hard and externally hard, and it's just an act that they can shed tears like this. And in the case of the nisattvas, there's some softness coming externally, but internally there's still the retention of hardness. This is how he makes the distinction in the categories. So he describes these as follows. Bhavas of happiness, sadness, and so on do not become manifest in his heart, even after hearing about Hari's deeds, because of non-absorption therein. That is, because he lacks even the state of slipperiness. Oh, do I have a mistake here? Because he lacks even the state of slipperiness, seems like of heart. That is, of having a heart that is externally soft while remaining internally hard. Yeah. So, how could tears fall constantly from his eyes? They could only do so because he, whose heart is internally and externally hard, has made a show of shedding them merely as a practiced act. So this is the import of the statement, and this comes from Jiva Goswami's comment. So generally, however, a sattvika bhas arises in those whose minds are soft or slippery by nature, only in an assembly. So in other words, some people might have a more sentimental quality, and so he's allowing for that and saying, okay, but there's people, they go to some, lila kirtan, or they go to some, kadā or whatever, and then while they're in the crowd and while the beautiful artists or, speakers are presenting everything, then they're moved with emotion and so on. But then they go back and afterwards pursue their other non-devotional things. So he's calling that this slipperiness, where internally the person is hard. They're actually intentionally fostering these other desires and pursuits, but they just have this nature of being more sentimentally open and easily able to, quote unquote, feel or express emotion in a superficial sense. So this is what he's calling here the most common instance of what he calls nisattvas, where there isn't actually any sattva going on. The person's heart is not actually imbued with bhav. It's just, hard with mundanity. And still the person shows as if, or can appear like, a bhakta who does shed tears out of bhav. Then pratipas are described, those sattvika bhasas of someone other than a well-wisher of Krishna, that is, in asuras, enemies, and so on, which occur as a result of anger, fear, or otherwise in relation to Krishna, are called adversarials. As is described in the following verse, hearing of the extremity of Kamsa's fear of Krishna, upon its being narrated in a Purana before him, someone of asuric disposition, that is, someone who empathized with Kamsa, then became restless in mind and contorted in face. There's 3 or 4 examples of these adversarials, but I quite liked this one at the end, so I used this one. I didn't include them all. I find that one funny. So, this non-bhakta is then connecting at heart, so to speak, with the plight of another non-bhakta, and feeling this sense of let's say being indignant, so to speak, just as Kamsa was. So this would be called an adversarial, or it's an emotion coming out, which is actually an outcome of anti-devotion, so to speak. So thus it's another category. In other words, the nisattva, it's not anti-devotional, it's just based on, they're just internally hard by virtue of pursuing moksha or enjoyment or things that aren't, so to speak, directly against Krishna, they're just other. But in this case, it's that not only just other, but it's actually related to something that's specifically inimical to Krishna. Therefore, the fourth category. All right, pardon me for going so long. Lastly, Jiva Goswami has a few nice comments on these, and then we'll conclude for today. They appear like sattvas, yet are not actually so. This characteristic is accordingly understood by the term sattvika bhasa. That is, the term sattvika bhasa refers to bhavas that appear to be sattvika bhavas, but are not actually sattvika bhavas. In this manner, the author specifically enumerates 4 types of these. He speaks this in the following verses. In the case of a sattvika bhas, being a reflection or a glimmer of rati, there is ratyabhas bhavatva, that is, then the sattvika bhas is called a ratyabhas bhava, a sattvika bhas arising from a semblance of rati. In the case of the psyche being seized only by a semblance of delight, amazement, or otherwise, there is sattva bhas bhavatva, that is, then the sattvika bhas is called a sattva bhas bhava, a sattvika bhas arising from a semblance of sattva. In the case of even a semblance of delight, amazement, or otherwise, not touching the interior and not touching even the exterior, there is nisattvatva, that is, then the sattvika bhas is called a nisattva, a sattvika bhav in which there is no occurrence of sattva at all, not even a semblance. Pratipa's adversarials, however, are indeed disagreeable because of their arising from an inimical attitude towards Bhagavan. This is the purport. The reckoning of these nisattvas among the sattvika bhasas, however, is only because they appear like sattvikas to the ignorant. So there you have it. In other words, why would you call even nisattvas, those that don't even have sattva, a semblance of sattva? You wouldn't. But nevertheless, people still mistake them as that. So because of the fact that they're devoid of that but mistaken for that, they're categorized as being a semblance of that. So this is to justify the point earlier where Rupa Goswami said that the wise easily distinguish between the two. So not everybody's wise. So to accommodate that, then this point is also made. So I won't belabor the point any further. In gist, this is, all the main points from the Sindhu and the commentaries related to what are these sattvika bhavas. So the main point to understand is that sattva is defined here as the citta imbued with bhava. Bhava bhakti, synonym rati. When the citta becomes imbued with bhava, then the tears, the trembling, the various external involuntary expressions that emerge as a result of the influence of that bhava in the state of sattva, which then influences the prana, which then blends with the elements to produce the heat or the water or the air or what have you, that causes the expression of these different states, discoloration, weeping, swooning, etc. This is what is called sattvika bhasas. But things that look like that can also be caused by things that are not that, and therefore we have all this categorization of semblances and, things that aren't this but are confused for that, and so on. So when Mahaprabhu is praying in our verse of discussion in the 6th verse of the Shikshastakam, when will my body become filled with horripilation? When will my mouth become filled with words stifled by stuttering? When will my eyes become filled with streams of flowing tears? He's praying to experience all these bhavas. So what is he really praying for then? He's praying for bhav. He's just praying for bhav and alluding to bhav by describing the symptoms that it produces. So why doesn't he just say, when will I feel bhava? When will bhava come into my heart? when I call your name? Why does he say, when will my eyes stream with tears? When will my mouth and voice stutter? When will my body horripilate when I call your name? Why does he pray for prema in this roundabout way by speaking of its effects rather than referring to it directly? That we'll discuss next time, and the literary significance of this manner of prayer and the content that it can evoke and allude to for the heart and mind. That will be where the commentary goes from here. So again, pardon me for going over time. I'll conclude here. Yes, I see a hand.
Is it my hand?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is great. I like this nicitaṁ description. Soft outside and inside hard. I never heard this expression. It's really accurate.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. First from the beginning, bodhika is to pray for something that one doesn't have, and siddhānta is something that someone has but hungers for it anyway. Is that right?
There was some prarthana and lalasamai.
Oh.
So some prarthana was to desire the thing you don't have, or to pray for or request the thing you don't have. And lalasamai was a longing that's emerging from the presence of bhava.
And so prarthana basically means prayer, but what does some prarthana exactly mean, like in etymological sense?
The some there can just be conceived of a suffix of fullness. So,
fullness, okay.
An earnest request or a strong request, something like this.
Mm-hmm. So you described all those subdivisions of bhava. So my question is, you described rushka bhava, which is dry, and I was wondering, what's bhava then? Is bhava rushka bhava also bhava?
Sorry, your voice just got a little bit soft there. You were saying, what is bhava?
Yes. What's no. I'm asking if is rushka bhava or different type of bhava?
I guess you could broadly say that. I mean, he's using the term rukshka specifically in reference to sattvika bhavas. So he's saying that, and then he's saying that ruksha sattvika bhavas are synonymous with ruddhayā bhas or bhava bhas.
Mm-hmm. But why is this categorized as a different bhava bhas? Because it's dry, it's artificial, or doesn't have any basis of bhava? Is that right?
I mean, he's talking about sattvika bhavas, and he's saying that then these are dry because they are quote-unquote sattvika bhavas, or they appear to be these involuntary emotional expressions, but they're devoid of bhava. Bhava is not their cause. So they're dry in the sense that bhava is not causing them.
I see. Got it. Now, another question. What's the difference? I couldn't understand the difference between sattvika bhavas and anubhavas. So anubhavas are symptoms, right? And sattvika bhavas, they're also symptoms. They're coming from sattva. So how are they different?
I talked about that for a few minutes earlier. I don't know if you heard that part.
Maybe I missed.
There's a section in the Sindhu where it directly says that sattvika bhavas and anubhavas are both quote-unquote effects or outcomes of bhava. So sattvika bhavas are just anubhavas. So then the reason that they're given a separate categorization is because the intellect doesn't mediate in the manner of their expression, whereas in what are categorized as anubhavas, the intellect mediates the way it's expressed.
Oh,
So if I clap or I sing or I dance, I'm also volitionally deciding to do that, and I'm also volitionally deciding how I do that. Whereas in the case of sattvika bhavas, someone might, be singing in the kirtan and then their voice is choking up and they didn't decide, okay, I'm going to choke up now and I'm going to choke up this much, but not that much. It's not up to them. It's, it's hard for them to even control it or hold it back. So because the intellect is not mediating in the way and the manner it's expressed, on that basis, he's making them a separate category.
I see. Beautiful. Thank you. It's very clarifying.
Pranam. Okay, great. So let's conclude here for the evening. And in our next discussion, if we're so blessed, we will jump into the rest of this discussion. Vaishnavebhyo namo nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe.